Okay, so here we are in the second part of our lecture, which is essentially what is Islam, what makes it up, and what are people doing when they practice it. So we're going to jump on in with a great quote from Reza Aslan, where he says, religions become institutions when the myths and rituals that once shaped their sacred histories are transformed into authoritative models of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, though one is often emphasized over the other. So orthodoxy being the correct interpretation of myths, and orthopraxy being the correct interpretation or maybe performance of rituals. So we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between doxa and praxis. So Aslan posits that orthodoxy and orthopraxy, or doxa and praxis, are kind of two ends of a spectrum of religious practice and the policing of religious practice. So Christianity, he says, is a great example of an orthodoxy religion, or he says the supreme example of an orthodoxic religion. It is principally one's beliefs expressed through creed that make one a faithful Christian. So that makes sense. It's also important for us to understand that this is not the only model. And so he helpfully defines Judaism as an orthopraxic religion, where it is principally one's actions expressed through the law that make one an observant Jew. Right? And that makes some sense. So if you have some familiarity with both of those religions, you can kind of see how that works. Now, he locates Islam closer to the orthopraxic end of the spectrum, but the Ulama, which we're going to talk about today, have tended to regard Islamic practice as informing Islamic theology, right? So the practice creates the theology, not the other way around. So therefore, orthopraxy and orthodoxy are intimately bound together in Islam, meaning that questions of theology or kalam are impossible to separate from questions of law or fiqh, and that would be practice, right? So in that sense, we move the margin a little bit closer to a mixture of the two, but still leaning more towards the orthopraxic than the orthodoxic, but it's a mix of the two. So what is the praxis? What does the practice of Islam involve? The 5 pillars of Islam are salat, which is prayer, which is done facing Mecca, and it includes prostration. Like there's a very specific set of prayers and gestures that go along with this. And depending on the sect one belongs to, there are set times of day in which that prayer happens. So that's pillar 1. The function of this pillar is to bind the community together. So most of the time, people are strongly encouraged to practice this as a community rather than individually. It's not like against the rules to practice it individually, but it is encouraged to participate in that communal act, right? The second pillar of Islam is zakat, or charity, which is the giving of alms. Like we talked a little bit about Muhammad's radical social and economic justice reforms. Almsgiving is a part of this. It's the mandatory tithe that is collected and then redistributed to the poor and the needy. And the idea behind this is that you should give away all of what you have because all of that is really God's. Right? So it's not just selfish to hang on to or hoard your wealth. It's like sacrilege, or maybe that's not even right. It's an insult. It's theft, right? Because it doesn't belong to you to hoard in the first place, is the idea behind this. So that's that one. And then you have Sawm, which is the fasting. Possibly one of the most visible sources or forms of Islam as it is expressed in people's daily lives. If you know an Islamic person, you probably know about their fasting during Ramadan. So fasting is a ritual fasting, and it's usually not a complete abstinence from all food and drink for an entire period, but the Ramadan fast goes from sunup to sundown for the entire month of Ramadan. There are exceptions to who should fast based on your bodily needs. If you're sick, if you're elderly, if you have certain conditions, if you're menstruating or pregnant or breastfeeding, all of those would excuse you from the practice of ritual fasting at that point in time. The purpose of this is very similar to the purpose of prayer in that it binds the community as one, particularly in the act of repentance for the things that for the things that we have done poorly, but also in remembrance of the fact that some folks suffer in this way all the time. Right? It is a reminder of suffering and poverty. And so it's an ascetic practice in this way. It is a purposeful taking on of suffering in order to increase piety and compassion. And then there's Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. The basic doctrine around this is that all able-bodied folks are supposed to make the Hajj at least once in their lifetime. And it's a very particular kind of pilgrimage. Yes, you go to Mecca, and yes, you participate in the circumambulation of the Kaaba, but there's more to that. There are additional rituals. There's running between hills, there's stoning a pillar, there are other steps involved. But the function, in particular, the main event is that circumambulation of the Kaaba. And one of the things that it is designed to do is to really highlight, to act as a communal meditative act where the meditation is on the oneness and the unity of God, specifically through the oneness and the unity of the bodies of the pilgrims that have all come and are wearing the same thing. They're all together, men and women. They're participating in the same motions. They're circulating the same spot, right? It's the combining of the many into one and the experience of unity that's at the center of the pilgrimage rite. And the last one is Shahada, or the expression of faith, right? We have heard already that there are two components to the Shahada, which is there is one God, Muhammad is his messenger. For Shiite folks, which we talked about in the last one, followers of Ali, there's another component, and that is that Ali is God's executor, right? So Ali is the person who takes over in the stead of Muhammad. So that's the expression of faith. This is the thing that one must believe, right? The doxa, you might say. So Shahada is the doctrine part of the 5 pillars, and Salat, Zakat, Sawm, and Hajj are the praxis part. So you can see how this might lean towards the orthopraxic in that sense. The practices themselves lead directly to the fundamental doctrine, which is Tawhid. So the idea of Tawhid is about the oneness of God, but it's not strictly just an expression of monotheism, but that the oneness is greater, right? God is oneness, is unity, indivisible, unique, and indefinable, right? God resembles nothing in the world in either essence or attribute. That's why it's not acceptable in Islam to depict God, right? Because that would be sacrilegious, because any depiction is always inherently flawed and incomplete. And the expression of this is often given as Allahu Akbar, which means God is greater, not God is great, but God is greater. And it's not greater than something. There's no object, just greater than everything, all the time. No than, actually, no, that's just greater. Tawhid suggests that God is beyond even language, right? And knowledge, because God is too big for the human mind, let alone the human words, to contain. And so that, put an asterisk on that, because that becomes a point of debate that creates different schools of thought. But what everybody does agree upon is God is wholly other to the human, right? The human is the small, the finite, the limited, the fragmentary, and the flawed. And God is the not that, the none of those things. Sufis, who are mystics, we'll talk a little bit more about them in the next section. But Sufis, they have a lovely expression where they say there can be nothing apart from God, right? God is the only being with real existence, the only reality. And if you're hearing echoes of some of those panentheistic views from the Indian subcontinent and their syncretic system, you are not alone. There is a kind of there is an echo between these two things, and that may not be coincidental, right? We certainly know that at this point those ideas had filtered from the Indian subcontinent westward through Afghanistan and those regions, to the point where it seems likely that the thought has influenced Jesus and his teachings, his turn the other cheek kind of stuff. And it may well have influenced the formation of Islam. Its opposite is shirk, which is anything that goes against God's oneness. So icons or anthropomorphizing God or even the Trinity, that is just super not okay in Islam. Is God cannot be three. God is one, only one, not three in one, not one that is three, but just one. And it's also the comparable to the Christian idea of sin. But sin does not include, it's not a big enough category to include everything that is shirk, right? So obstacles between the believer and God, like sin, qualify as shirk, but not because they're sins, but because they disrupt the unity of the believer and God, right? They create distance between the believer and God, and that's what is shirk. The distance is shirk, not the act itself. So together, this concept really gets at the unity of God. And I love this quote from Aslan, quoting a Sufi scholar, where he says, ultimately, Tawhid implies recognizing creation, right? Everything as a universal unity, without divisions into this world, hereafter, natural, supernatural, substance, meaning, spirit, body. Those divisions don't exist. In other words, the relationship between God and creation is like that between light and the lamp that emits it, right? One God, one creation, one God, one. So it's a pretty mystical conversation when you think about it. And sort of has fascinating ties to a number of other religious traditions that we've discussed. But let's talk a little bit more about the doctrine part. That's the core of the doctrine and the belief, but that's certainly not all of the doctrine. So the primary sources of doctrine are, of course, the Qur'an, the sacred scripture, but then there are also the Hadith and Sunna, which are oral traditions, and finally the Ulama, which is a body of religious scholars who try to make sense of all of the parts together in order to give practical guidance. So we'll start with the Quran. The key thing here is that Muhammad did not write it down, nor does it seem like he intended for it to be written down. Instead, the literal translation of the word Quran is recitation, or the recitation. So it seems pretty clear that Muhammad intended for the Quran to be passed down through memory, right? So this created a new class of scholars among his followers called the Qur'an, and he taught this first generation himself to memorize the surahs, the chapters of the Quran, and repeat them verbatim and hold them within themselves. That was the container for text, not a book, but people, living memory. It has 114 of these chapters called surahs. They are varying lengths, different numbers of verses, and they are all poetic. And as the Ummah, the people of Islam, as they extended, as their territory widened, as their religion spread, variations in this recitative tradition popped up. Local variations in Syria and in Baghdad and in Cairo, right? You had different versions in different places because memory is not an exact science, to be kind of literal about it. None of these differences were doctrinally significant, right? So they didn't change the meaning of any of the major themes or ideas, but they were enough that some folks, especially in Medina, became uncomfortable. So enter Uthman. Remember this guy, the crappy third caliph? I mean, I guess maybe I shouldn't say that. He's a rightly guided one after all. But the one thing he did do that seems to have gotten him that reputation for belonging to the rightly guided caliphs is that he collected the Qur'an together. So he gathered together all these different variations from different parts of the caliphate, and he collected them, and then that canonized the Medinan version. So why did he collect them from everywhere else? Well, to burn them. Bye-bye. We're the best. And this was a huge problem, particularly for folks in Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, not because they were so upset over the things that went missing from their tradition of the Quran, but because they believed that Uthman was overstepping the bounds of a secular ruler, right? He was not a religious authority, or not supposed to be. And so it wasn't his call to codify which version of the Quran is correct. His response was to brand them as infidels or unbelievers, right? Infidel means unfaithful, obviously. So that created a certain amount of tension that likely led to his downfall, including, I thought I had a little button next that talked about his assassination. But yes, this probably led directly to the conflicts that were already brewing because of his nepotism and incompetence. But then you add in a doctrinal upset, and suddenly people feel justified in rebelling. So the other innovation that this brought about is that reading the Quran becomes a thing, which was not... That was not a thing before he collected it together and codified a written version, because it was always a collective activity. Somebody would recite and others would listen, and they might recite after. And so this was always done together. But when you have a Quran outside of a living person, you now can interact directly with text as a private activity. What this also does is it fixes the order of the Quran. And this is something that really baffles me, particularly as an outside person, as to how this choice was made, because the books of the Quran were put in order of longest to shortest, which means that there is almost no logic to the content. So you don't have verses in chronological order. You can't follow them. And you don't have verses in thematic order. So you can't, it's very difficult to navigate, particularly as somebody who's looking in from the outside. Nonetheless, there are navigation tools that are created to help navigate that. And that's part of what the Ulama does. We'll get into that a little bit, but let's focus for a moment on what the Quran means within the Islamic community. It's different in some ways from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures because it's not about God or Muhammad, but it is God's words as were spoken through the mouth of Muhammad, right? That's how I believe it's figured. Yes, in an admittedly imperfect because human language, which we're going to come back to. But the key thing about this is that it's not about Muhammad's life or necessarily even his actions. It is about the things that he says, which are themselves sacred because he is just the conduit for what God says in this tradition. This does mean that translation becomes a major theological issue, right? So the Quran is only authorized in Arabic. It's not that it's not translated, but that translation is necessarily a desacralizing process. So what you read in translation is not the sacred Quran. It's an approximation. And that's not a new concern, right? Translation was also an issue heavy on the minds of the Jews. So the Tower of Babel that is in the Hebrew Bible specifically tells the story of humanity working together to build a tower that almost reaches God. And God is like, whoa, 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 we can't have any of this. And so not only does he destroy the tower, but he also disperses the people and gives them different languages, confuses their languages, right? So none of them can understand each other after that. And the idea here is that if they can't understand each other, they can't work together, right? God is like, well, humans can come pretty close to usurping God. If they work together, that's not good. So we disperse them. That's the story. But the interesting linguistic background to that story is that Jews believe that nobody speaks the original language of Adam, right? And that the language of God was the language that Adam spoke. And in that language, there's never meaning missing from the word, right? The word and its meaning are so unified that perfect understanding is possible. And after the Tower of Babel, nobody speaks God's language anymore. Nobody speaks the Adamic language. They all speak some other earthly language, which is always an imperfect approximation of the perfect language, right? So everybody's language, all of it. Like, it's not that Hebrew is better. It's not. It's that it's all somehow, it's like, it's all a token of loss, right? All language signifies a lost perfection and perfect one-to-one relationship between sign and meaning. So this was a thing that Jewish folks have been thinking about. And in fact, all the way up through Derrida and Paul de Man, they're still thinking about this through the story of the Towers of Babel. But Christians also thought a lot about this and what does translation do to our sacred texts. So what you see over here is Jerome, who is famous primarily for translating the Bible, and I'm going to use that term loosely, but translating the entire canon of Christian scriptures into Latin, right? So if you look at those dates, 382, 405, so that means we're post-Nicaea, we're post-Athanasius, but we're like mid-Augustine, right? And so Jerome is on the scene. He's somewhere over in what would now be Bosnia, so somewhere between Rome and Greece, and he is a Latin scholar, but he's also well-versed in Greece because that was the language of learning. And what he recognizes is that more people are going to read Latin in the Roman Empire than read Greek. And so he starts out by correcting an existing translation of the New Testament by comparing it to the original Greek, right? And then after that, he starts translating bits of the Hebrew canon, or what Christians would call the Old Testament, from its Greek source, which is the Septuagint. So the Greek Septuagint was pulled together under Hellenism, and that was the kind of authoritative Hebrew canon, except it was in Greek, right? It's the 70 books in Greek. And so Jerome actually went looking for the Hebrew in order to collate that against the Greek and to make sure that there wasn't a Hellenization in the meaning of the text, right? And Jerome really agonized about this because he essentially said, he's like, what am I supposed to translate? Am I supposed to translate word for word or verbatim? I can do that, but then in the next language, it might not make sense. Like the ideas, the things, the race might not be there. Or I can translate the race, the ideas, and make sure that I'm faithful to the ideas, but then the words are all different, right? And he really, really agonizes about this. So Islam is not alone in worrying about this. This is thrown in here because the Codex Amiatinus is one of the earliest copies of a compiled Bible all in one. Look how massive it is. It is massive, massive, right? It's like this. I should have gotten a picture with a person's hand in it. But annoyingly, everybody was wearing gloves, and that is not how that happens. So I didn't. The point I want to make with the Codex Amiatinus, though, is another contrast with the Qur'an is that the Christian scriptures, like the Jewish scriptures, are a collection of separate texts, right? And so they aren't even compiled into a single book very often. And look what happens when they do that. The Quran, on the other hand, is a single text, right? And it is much smaller and much shorter, and it doesn't have any different authors, and there are no additional prophets, and there's no reconciling of perspectives. There's certainly reconciling early revelation versus late, but that's kind of the difference. And what this means is that the texts themselves, they're not letters, they're not narratives, they are sayings, and they are straight from God, and that makes the words themselves holy. Now, there's this other idea in Islam. It is not universal, but certain arms of Islam subscribe to this idea of the Kitab, which is the mother of books. And the idea here is that all of the holy and revealed scriptures derive from a single divine book that is concealed in heaven, and that portions of that book are given out at different times as are appropriate to the development of humanity, right? And so the Torah, the Gospels, and the Quran are all part of a single cohesive narrative that's centrally about humanity's relationship to God. It doesn't annul previous scripture. It doesn't replace it, which is kind of what the Christian New Testament says it's doing to the Old Testament. It says it completes them, right? And this is why Islam considers Jews, Christians, and Muslims to all be part of a single ummah, right? People of the book. So what are the other sources? Now we get into the Hadith and the Sunnah, both of which are oral commentary traditions, and they're used to contextualize the verses in the Quran. The Hadith is about the tradition of the wisdom and the sayings and the life of Muhammad, right? They give context. And then the Sunnah is similar, but this is the best that I can understand of the difference between the two. The Sunnah is passing down customs of behavior, and that's based on Muhammad's behavior, versus other things he said that are not the Quran, right? And these are both verified by the line of transmission that they carry with them. So-and-so got this from so-and-so, who got this from so-and-so, who got this from the prophet. The last arm here is the Ulama. And these are the religious authorities. And these are worth taking some time to really understand because they become a part of our modern tradition. So when Muhammad dies, secular authority goes to the caliph, and religious authority goes to a group of religious scholars called the Ulama. And they are responsible for instituting Shariah Law, which in some contexts becomes a very scary word, and we're going to talk about why it shouldn't be scary. Shariah law is just the judgment of all actions in Islam, as good or bad. It's not binding. It's not law in the sense of like the laws of the state. It's moral law, essentially, and it is practiced as a way of, it's like confession in the Catholic Church, right? In that sense, also, the priest judges whether your actions are good or bad and then gives you appropriate atonement, right? That's how Sharia law functions as well, except asterisk, when you get into a country where theology is the law, that's called a theocracy, and that's a different form of government. But most places, they're not the same thing. So there are different types of behaviors in Sharia law. There's meritorious behavior, which is behavior that should be rewarded, but you don't deserve punishment for not doing it, right? It's like the above and beyond. And then there's the obligatory. You are rewarded for doing it, or should be, but if you don't do it, you're also punished because you should be doing it. And then there's neutral stuff. Excuse me, I have the hiccups. They're neither rewarded nor punished. There's the reprehensible, which you shouldn't be doing, but you're not punished for. And then there's the forbidden, which you shouldn't be doing and you are punished for. So the idea behind Sharia as a principle is not only to forbid vice, but also to promote virtue, right? And that's why there are these categories of neutral, obligatory, and meritorious as well. And this is what leads to fiqh, or the practice of Islamic jurisprudence, which is the foundation of our modern jurisprudence, like the way that it functions today in our culture, the way that the law is used and practiced today. So we're going to get into a little bit of that, and then this section will be done. So the sources for the fiqh are, of course, the Qur'an, but the Qur'an doesn't have rules about everything. So then you have the Sunnah. So when the Qur'an doesn't tell you how many camels you have to repay for a particular action, then the life of Muhammad is used as an example. One comment, though, is that the Sunnah is really not codified until about the 9th century. And so it's a better reflection of the consensus of what is proper behavior in the 9th century than it is of what was actually happening in the 7th century during the lifetime of the Prophet. And then you have the Qiyah, which is analogical argument, right? So if there's still nothing in either the Quran or the Sunnah that you can draw upon to try and make a good judgment, a wise judgment, you can make an analogy to something. And then there's ijma, or judicial consensus. And I'm going to come back to this because I want to name the last one. And then there's ijtihad, or independent reasoning that could be accepted or rejected. So the independent judicial reasoning essentially was something that a local leader would be like, well, I don't have any sources for determining for real what this should be, so I'm going to make my best judgment and you're free to take it or leave it. And that's a fatwa, is what that ruling is called. But let's back up to ijma, or judicial consensus. This is the process of using precedent to decide later cases. So our entire U.S. case law system works on the system of precedent that was established under Islamic jurisprudence in the Islamic Golden Age. So we will talk a little bit more about this in the next section, but I just want to flag that here for your attention, that this idea of, well, if this was the judgment before, that's the judicial consensus, and we're going to go with what the judges decided before, unless or until we have some reason not to, right? And this leads to different schools of legal reasoning. There's traditionalist schools versus rationalist schools. The traditionalists think that everything should be exactly the way it was back then, and the rationalists are like, that doesn't make any sense. Everything should be subject to human reason. They don't get along. They have different schools. The Shiites have their own schools of legal reasoning. And eventually these separate schools ossify or calcify or fossilize into institutions, right? We've been talking about that movement from practice into institution, well, this is how it becomes a legal institution, right? You get these schools of thought that gradually transform into legal institutions. And when they do, the diversity of ideas and the freedom of opinion that characterize the early development, that period of debate and questioning and reasoning, gives way to rigid formalism, strict adherence to precedents, and an almost complete stultification of independent thought. So, and that's right around the 11th through 13th centuries is when that is happening. And that's Reza Aslan's analysis of how you get to a position where a religion that prioritizes reasoning from what you have and trying to understand the complexities of all these different layers becomes a set of rigid rules. The last major portion of this lecture is just to show you the accomplishments of the Islamic Golden Age. So this will be a tour of some of the key accomplishments that I'd like to highlight of the Islamic regions of the world from about 750 to the end of the Middle Ages.